Good morning. Good early morning. Sandwiches. That's where we start today on page 77. Is an incredibly in-depth thing about how much Mox cares about sandwiches and his theories about sandwiches and why some of the even the best sandwiches in the world that he has gotten to experience have fallen short for one reason or another. Within this incredibly detailed chapter are are his theories about the elements that you need for a perfect sandwich, his sketch drawings of why this pretzel based sandwich failed and how they could have made it better, um, a description of some of his favorite sandwiches, and why the diagonal cut is the way that you go with square bread because you have more entry points for you. It's hysterical and I gotta say, unfailingly accurate. It's one of those things where once you read it, you go like, "Oh yeah, he's right about the sandwich thing." Then we jump into December 31st, 2020. Um, Renee's pregnant. It's going to be a tame New Year's, right? He talks about a year ago when they were at the AEW New Year's Eve party in Jacksonville, taking full advantage of the open bar. Again, knowing that he went into rehab for alcohol, and the alcohol references to this are like nonstop. But the reason it's so short is because he's citing, like, man, it's a big change from where we were 2 years ago. And so he goes right to the 2 years ago, December 31st, 2018, and just how miserable he was with WWE and how much he was complaining and how much Renee was just like, she's like, good, if you want to go to Japan, go to Japan, do whatever you want to do. And you realize how important she is. Again, it's show don't tell. He can say all day how important she is and how valuable she is, but this book is very good at just showing, not telling. About everything, about wrestling, about their relationship, about the relationship he has with other people, how much he admires certain people. He's got that staph infection, which is a problem. They go hiking. He starts thinking about life outside of the WWE and what's appealing about it, right? It'll be cool, just be like, I'll make my own schedule. If we want to take a vacation, I just won't book myself on a show this week. So he sort of resigned himself to, I'm gonna basically do indies in Japan and that kind of thing. And how exciting it would be to just design his own T-shirts. And then he ends it with, it's a strange coincidence, unbeknownst to me, that at this exact moment an announcement was being made to the wrestling world. A new promotion had been formed, and it was called All Elite Wrestling. So his path is about to cross with that one. He has a pick flick, Terminator 2, Judgment Day. He explains about why did they make so many Terminators? They should have just made two. And a story about him getting to recreate a Terminator scene with Arnold Schwarzenegger for a promotion they were doing. And then he has a line that from Roadhouse. So is he alluding to a future film thing? I don't know. He talks about Cincinnati and everything about Cincinnati, including, of course, the Skyline chili that they made numerous references to in the last AEW show in Cincinnati. He's like, what's a typical person from Cincinnati like? This one time he had Bruno, who's a WWE backstage legend, asked him to get him a couple of chili dogs from Skyline, and how he should have waited to eat it, but he just ate it, and then he went out and did his match and had heartburn and all this kind of stuff. His affection for his hometown is really obvious. And you could tell that he wanted to be accurate. Like, he's like, there's no typical this, there's no typical that, there's this part of town, that part of town. Again, it's just another way to sort of get into his mind. Right? And he talks about being one of the Piccadilly kids, which meant you had a certain kind of reputation. And the connotation was negative. When you go to public school and they go like, oh, those are Piccadilly kids. It was basically the kids who were going to be trouble, or they weren't going to be as smart or learned or work as hard in school and that kind of thing. And how it was the kind of place where kids would just show up at your door, knock on the door, hey, you want to go play baseball, you want to go play football. And then how he got sort of into wrestling, right? He was like, they would just kind of wrestle each other. And who they were calling out, just to put it in time. I'm Brett. I'm Razor. I'm Undertaker. And that they didn't know that wrestling wasn't real. So they would just beat the crap out of each other, more or less. Talked about Donnie and Kevin. That they were the ones who really introduced him into wrestling. And then what a big deal Brian Pillman was, because he was a Cincinnati guy, and how he found out about WCW through his friends and Brian Pillman. And what a big deal, like, I Like to Hurt People, which is this cult classic movie kind of tape thing. Again, the perspective is so different now, right? Because of the internet, you have access to everything, and everything's constantly streaming. But I guess he was part of the last generation where he was young, that when something came up that was pro wrestling, it was a really big deal. When you saw pro wrestling out in the wild, as it were. He goes into these really detailed things about his early childhood in Piccadilly. And that it wasn't all misery, that they did have a lot of fun. But then also what you had to put up with. Again, he was so smart to not put this in the beginning and not to do things chronologically. And what it was like to get his ass kicked. He just describes getting his ass whipped by these two guys. And there's no ego about it. There's no like, but I was going to get him back, but I was going to da-da-da-da-da-da, though that did happen. And then the sensation of, he had his face messed up in this fight, but then he goes home and he puts his like makeshift title belt over his shoulder and poses in the mirror like, this is what I look so cool. Again, it's a mentality that a few people can understand, and even not everybody in the wrestling business can understand, but that definitely spoke to me, and that visual image did. Then he does a spin it up about the importance of Green Day Insomniac in his life. And then about this kid they all called Baio. Because I guess he kind of resembled Scott Baio, and just what a jerk he was and what an asshole he was. Like the Scott Baio in real life. And and how it was this sort of turning point in his life. About how they were playing tackle football on the concrete, and he tore this guy's basketball jersey, so Scott Baio was just determined to get that $50 back. How Mox's mom told him, piss off, basically. And so he was going to get it out of Mox. So at some point, they're going to have a fight. And had this fight. And how it was obviously kind of a big moment in his life. I won't spoil it for you, but it's pretty great. It also sort of broke protocol, because normally he goes personal wrestling, but this time he just decided, I was talking about my childhood and as a Piccadilly kid, and this important thing popped into my mind, so I'm going to talk about it. So he does, but it's really wonderful. And then his flick pick is Crimson Tide, which he goes into great detail about, because he also talks about the time he got to go on a nuclear submarine and what that sensation was like and how cool it was to do these tribute to the troop shows. Really wonderful. HWA Chunk, late 2003. How he hears the banging of guys bumping in a ring in a warehouse, and how it draws him in, and how he starts wrestling school. And he's only 17. He lied, or he just never answered the question. He knew he was supposed to be 18, but he just never had to answer the question, how old are you? He lifted weights, and he just talks about Les Thatcher, and how he sort of figured out Les Thatcher enough early that he could impress him. It's like, who are your favorites? Instead of saying like Ultimate Warrior, somebody he says like Dean Malenko, and he liked the more technical guys, and so that got on Les's good side right away. And he talks about the sort of simple stuff about going to early wrestling shows and who he saw and how he figured out what wrestling was just by overhearing a guy call out a spot in the ring when he's watching it. And I love that he's putting these kind of details in, because most of the time people don't have that in their wrestling books. But at what point did you figure out wrestling was what it is instead of what you thought it was when you were a kid? And what were the spots that you heard? And what was wrestling training really like? And what was going through your mind? What feelings did you have? What frightened you? Again, so open, so honest. How he went to the back door of the school first, not the front door, and felt kind of like an asshole. And then he talks about the quotes that are on the wall and how he made a mental note of, I'm going to read them later, but right now I'm just trying to take all this in. And then he tells us about what the quotes were. And how he really loved Sandman from ECW, but he was smart enough not to mention that to Les Thatcher, which made me laugh pretty hard. Yeah, he answered with, we said, well, who are your favorites? He said Benoit, Jericho, Brett, Malenko. And the importance of, like one of the first matches he was shown was Chris Benoit and Kurt Angle from Royal Rumble 03, which was an incredible technical match. And they're breaking it down. But how the match that really made an impression took place in Cincinnati, and it was when they would do the Brian Pillman Memorial shows that Les Thatcher would kind of run, and it was considered perhaps the greatest wrestling match ever, which was Chris Benoit and William Regal. And the legendary story, and a lot of people probably haven't heard this story, but I've heard it a million times, but I thought that this was really cool. So they did the greatest wrestling match of all time, according to a lot of people, right? And Chris Benoit is just sitting in the dressing room, and Regal walks in, drops his bag, and sits down. Chris says, "What do you want to do tonight?" Regal says, "How about the finish we did that one time?" Chris says, "Great." And then he says, "Okay." And he gets up and walks away. And they didn't talk to each other again until they locked up. And they pulled off that great match. That's what pros they were. And pretty great. Pretty wonderful. Pretty great early education in wrestling. But I like that he includes this is when I started watching it. These are the two friends that really got me deep into it. This is how I learned more. Then we'd go into the HWA local shows, and then I went to wrestling school. I like that he includes that all in the same chapter, because it really is all a part of your wrestling education. See there? There's my kid. getting ready to go to school pretty soon. Um, and then for his spin it up music, he talks about the game, the documentary, and hip hop, and how he got introduced to hip hop, and all of that stuff. And then he goes more into his training. Again, just, dude, this book is such a great journey. And that's where I'm going to stop for today. I highly recommend this book. And a couple people contacted me and there's like, oh, I'm going to wait till it gets to audiobook. Let me say this. And I get the convenience and the love of the audiobook, especially if you work a job where you can kind of listen to music or you can listen to something. I totally get that. I will say this is one of those books that I think you want to physically have in your hand. Now, I'm an old guy, so of course I love having the actual hardcover book, but I think just being able to have a thing with which to refer, even if it's digital, right? Just something where you can read it and you can reread it and kind of go back and sort of jump around. I think it's going to be one of those kind of books. So I would highly advise people who are listening to this, get a hold of this book on Kindle or a hard copy. It's a book that you're going to want to have, and it's going to be a book that you're going to be proud to possess. And I don't think listening to it straight through an audiobook is the same thing at all. Just my opinion as an old dude. In any case, I'll be back with a report later on today, so that way I can be all caught up. And this is Veronica.
He's so old that dinosaurs say, hey, look, a human from millions of years in the future. Oh!
Way to sell it, kid.